There is a particular kind of laughter, reserved for women who have nothing left to lose. Marceline Roberts heard it the morning she announced she would marry the village blacksmith, a poor, soot-handed stranger who spoke to no one and smiled at even fewer. The bakers laughed behind their counters. The seamstresses laughed into their sleeves. Even the vicar's wife, a woman of supposed Christian charity, laughed loudly enough that Marceline heard it from 3 streets away. They called her desperate. They called her foolish. They said poverty had finally driven her to madness, marrying a man who owned nothing but an anvil and a forge that barely kept him fed through winter. None of them knew what Marceline herself didn't yet know. That the blacksmith's hands, calloused and burned from years at the fire, had once held documents that could topple Parliament. That the quiet stranger, who never met anyone's eyes, carried a secret so dangerous men had already died protecting it. That somewhere beneath the soot and the silence stood a duke, hunted, hiding and counting down the days until an enemy stole everything he had left. 3 days after her wedding, Marceline Roberts stepped out of a carriage in front of iron gates, taller than her cottage, and watched an army of servants drop into a bar before a man she had married, believing he was poor. But the gates were only the beginning. Behind those gates waited a conspiracy 2 decades in the making, a debt that had never been an accident, a document buried since before Marceline was born, capable of destroying one of the most powerful men in England, and a love neither she nor the Duke had any right to expect, born not from comfort, but from fire, storm, and the kind of danger that either breaks 2 people apart or binds them together so completely that nothing, not even an empire of lies, can ever tear them loose again. By the end of this story, you will understand something the village of Hollow Brook never could. They did not laugh at a foolish woman. They laughed at the woman who would, in time, save a duke, expose a traitor, and prove that love built in desperation can become the strongest love of all. Stay with me until the very end. This is not a story you will forget quickly. The storm had been building all afternoon, gathering its strength over the hills of Hollow Brook, the way grief gathers in a chest long before it finally breaks. By evening, it had become something cruel, something with teeth, hurling rain against the thin walls of the Roberts cottage, as though the heavens themselves demanded entry. Marceline knelt beside her mother's bed, a single candle guttering on the nightstand, its flame bending sideways in the draught that slipped through the cracked window frame. Phoebe Roberts lay beneath a thin quilt, her chest rising and falling with the shallow, rattling breath of a woman who had been fighting an illness far longer than her body could endure. "Drink, Mama," Marceline whispered, lifting a spoon of bitter medicine to her mother's lips. Just a little more. Phoebe's eyes fluttered open, pale and tired, but still holding that stubborn warmth that had carried her through 20 years of widowhood. "You look thinner than last week," she murmured. "Have you eaten?" "I have eaten plenty," Marceline lied, smoothing the quilt over her mother's frail shoulders. It was a lie she had told so many times it no longer felt heavy on her tongue. The truth was that the larder held nothing but a heel of bread and half a jar of preserves, and Marceline had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. She had given her portions to her mother instead, telling herself that hunger was easier to bear than guilt. The fire in the hearth was dying, the last log nearly consumed, and Marceline knew there would be no more wood until she found coin to buy it. She rose to check the window latch when the sound reached her. Wheels grinding over wet gravel, the heavy snort of a horse pulling to a stop just beyond their gate. Her stomach turned to stone. No doctor visited this late. No friend owned a carriage. She crossed to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. A black carriage stood in the rain, its lacquered sides gleaming under a flash of lightning, and a man stepped down with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told no. Edmund Shaw. Marceline's hand tightened on the curtain. She had met him only twice before, both times over matters concerning her late father's debts, and both times she had left the conversation feeling picked clean by a vulture wearing fine boots. She opened the door before he could knock, refusing to give him the satisfaction. "Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It is rather late for a visit." "Miss Roberts." He removed his hat with theatrical politeness, rainwater dripping from its brim onto her doorstep. "I would not intrude if the matter were not urgent." She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway, blocking his view of her sleeping mother, and waited. "Your father's debt," Edmund said, "has come due in full, including the interest accrued over the past 3 years. "My father has been dead for 3 years, Marceline said. "You know this." "I do." Edmund's smile did not reach his eyes, which is why the debt now rests with his widow, and in her incapacity, with you. "You have 1 week, Miss Roberts, 7 days to produce the sum, or this cottage, and the land beneath it, will be seized." The rain seemed to grow louder in her ears. "That is not possible. We do not have such a sum. We never have." "Then I suggest you find it." Edmund placed his hat back upon his head. "Or find someone willing to find it for you. A husband, perhaps. Though I imagine that prospect grows thinner each year, you remain unmarried." The cruelty of it struck her like a slap, but she refused to let him see her flinch. "Good evening, Mr. Shaw." She closed the door before he could say more, pressing her back against it, listening to the carriage wheels retreat into the storm. Behind her, she heard her mother stir. "Marceline?" Phoebe's voice was faint. "Who was that?" "No one, Mama," Marceline said softly. "Go back to sleep." She did not sleep that night. She sat by the dying fire until the last ember turned to ash, and when dawn refused to come gently, she rose, wrapped herself in her father's old coat, and walked out into the rain because the walls of the cottage had become too small to hold the weight pressing on her chest. She did not know where she was walking. She only knew she could not breathe inside that house, surrounded by the smell of illness and the sound of her mother's failing lungs. The rain soaked through the coat within minutes, plastering her hair to her face, but she did not turn back. It was at the edge of the village green, near the old forge that had stood since before her father was born, that she finally stopped and saw him. A man stood beneath the meagre shelter of the forge's awning, his shirt soaked through, his dark hair dripping rain down, a face carved with quiet exhaustion. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man she had seen in Hollow Brook, his forearms streaked with soot and old burns, his hands wrapped in worn leather gloves stained black from years at the anvil. Frederick Goodwin, the blacksmith. She knew him only the way the village knew him. A man who kept to himself, who worked from dawn until the light failed, who spoke rarely and smiled even less. Some called him strange, others called him cold. No one in Hollow Brook claimed to know him well, and Marceline, until that night, had never had reason to look twice at him. But now, standing in the storm with her own grief threatening to swallow her whole, she found herself walking toward the one person in the village who looked as alone as she felt. He noticed her before she reached him, straightening from where he leaned against the doorframe, his dark eyes finding hers through the rain with an attention that startled her. Most men in the village looked past her, or looked at her with pity, or looked at her the way one looks at a problem to be solved. Frederick Goodwin looked at her as though he had been waiting for her to arrive. "You'll catch your death out here," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, but there was something beneath it, a clarity, a precision in the way he shaped his words that did not match the soot on his hands. "I think I already have," Marceline said, and to her own horror, her voice cracked, and the tears she had refused to shed in front of Edmund Shaw finally broke free. She expected him to look away, embarrassed, the way most men would. Instead, he stepped forward, just enough to offer her shelter beneath the awning, careful not to crowd her. "Tell me," he said simply. And she did. She did not know why. Perhaps because he was a stranger, and strangers were sometimes easier to bleed in front of than the people who loved you. But she told him everything. The debt, the 7 days, her mother's illness, the years of scraping and surviving and pretending to neighbors that the Roberts family was simply private, not desperate. Frederick listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening once when she mentioned Edmund Shaw's name, though she did not notice it in the dark. When she finished, the rain had begun to ease, and she felt foolish, raw and exposed in front of a man she barely knew. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I should not have burdened you with this." "You haven't burdened me," Frederick said. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in years, as though someone was truly seeing her, not the daughter of a debtor, not a girl to be pitied, but a woman who had carried far too much for far too long. "Marry me," he said. The words landed in the space between them, like a stone dropped into still water. "What?" Marceline took a step back. "Mr. Goodwin, I do not think you understand." "I understand entirely," he said. "Your mother needs medicine and a roof that does not threaten to collapse. Your family needs the debt cleared before the week is through. I have enough to settle it, and I am asking you to marry me in exchange." "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said, and something flickered behind his eyes she could not name, something that looked almost like certainty, like a decision made long before this night. "I am not a romantic man, Miss Roberts. I will not pretend to offer you a love match, but I can offer you safety, for yourself, for your mother." "That is not nothing." Marceline studied him in the dim light, the soot on his hands, the quiet steadiness in his voice, the strange dignity that seemed to sit oddly on a blacksmith's shoulders. She thought of her mother's shallow breathing. She thought of 7 days. She thought of Edmund Shaw's cruel smile. 3 days, she said finally. "Give me 3 days to think and to tell my mother." 3 days, Frederick agreed. She turned and walked back into the rain, her heart hammering with something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but some trembling thing caught between the two. When she told her mother the following morning, Phoebe Roberts laughed, a weak, disbelieving laugh that turned quickly into a fit of coughing. "The blacksmith?" she said, once she had caught her breath. "Marceline, the man owns nothing but soot and silence. He owns enough to clear the debt," Marceline said, "and we have no other offer, Mama. No other path." Word spread through Hollow Brook faster than the storm itself had passed. By the time Marceline walked to the market the next day, she could feel the eyes on her, hear the whispers that did not bother to lower themselves as she passed. Marrying the smith, is she? Desperate, poor thing. Can't blame her, I suppose, with that mother of hers so ill. He'll work her to the bone, same as he works that forge. A cluster of women near the butcher's stall laughed outright, one of them dabbing at her eyes, as though Marceline's ruin were the finest comedy Hollow Brook had seen all year. Marceline kept her chin high and her steps steady, though each word landed like a small stone against her back. She told herself it did not matter what the village thought. She told herself this was survival, not romance, and survival did not require anyone's approval. But that night, lying awake beside her mother's bed, she found herself thinking of Frederick Goodwin's eyes in the rain, the way he had looked at her, as though she were not a problem, not a burden, but someone worth choosing. She did not yet understand how dangerous that feeling would become. Greetings, dear viewers. Your support has brought this channel farther than I ever imagined, and we are so grateful. If you enjoy these tales of old Victorian England, do well to subscribe, leave a like, tell us where in the world you are listening from, the time and the day, and support us in ways that you can. Thank you so much. Now then, let us return to Marceline, standing at the edge of a decision that will change everything she has ever known. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place on a grey Thursday morning in the small stone chapel at the edge of Hollow Brook, attended by no one but the vicar, Marceline's mother, carried in on a borrowed chair, too weak to stand, and a handful of curious villagers who had come not to celebrate, but to witness the spectacle of it. Marceline wore her mother's old wedding dress, taken in at the waist, the lace yellowed slightly with age. Frederick wore a plain, dark coat, scrubbed clean of soot for the occasion, his dark hair combed back, his expression unreadable. "He looks like he's attending a funeral, not a wedding," someone whispered behind her, and Marceline did not turn to see who said it. When the vicar asked Frederick to take her hand, his fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that surprised her, careful, deliberate, as though he understood she was fragile glass that had survived too many cracks already. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip did not crush. It steadied. "Do you, Frederick Goodwin, take this woman?" "I do," he said, before the vicar had even finished the question, and something in his voice made Marceline glance up at him. He was not looking at the vicar. He was looking at her, and there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that did not belong to a man marrying a stranger out of mere convenience. "Do you, Marceline Roberts, take this man?" "I do," she said, and the words felt heavier in her mouth than she expected, as though some part of her already understood she was stepping into a current far stronger than she could see. When Frederick lifted her veil to kiss her, as custom required, his lips brushed hers briefly, chaste, restrained, but not cold. She felt the warmth of his breath against her cheek for a moment longer than necessary, and when he pulled back, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not have time to examine. Outside the chapel, the debt collector's paper had already been settled, a sum delivered the previous evening that had left even Edmund Shaw momentarily speechless before he masked his confusion with a thin, calculating smile. "Where does a blacksmith find such coin?" he had murmured to no one in particular, and the question followed Marceline through her wedding morning like a shadow she could not shake. 3 days after the vows, a carriage arrived at the cottage. Not the small cart Marceline had expected, but a polished black coach, drawn by 4 matched horses, its doors marked with a crest she did not recognize. "This is yours?" she asked Frederick, who stood beside the carriage with an expression she could not quite read. "It will explain itself," he said, and something in his tone made her stomach tighten with unease. She had already settled her mother into a comfortable room at a neighboring widow's house, arranged for a physician to call daily, and embraced Phoebe with a promise to send word as soon as she was settled in her new home, wherever that home might be, for Frederick had been frustratingly vague on the matter. The journey took most of the day, the carriage rolling through countryside that grew steadily grander the farther they travelled from Hollow Brook, rolling hills giving way to manicured parkland, narrow lanes widening into proper roads lined with old oaks. "Frederick," Marceline said, watching the landscape change through the window. "Where exactly are we going?" "Home," he said simply, and offered nothing more. By late afternoon, the carriage slowed, and Marceline pressed her face to the window, her breath catching in her throat. Ravenscar Court rose out of the mist ahead of them, like a kingdom forgotten by time. Towers of pale stone reaching toward a sky still heavy with the last of the storm, windows glinting gold with candlelight, gardens stretching in every direction, farther than her eyes could follow. Iron gates, taller than 2 men, stood open at the end of the drive, and beyond them a line of servants had already gathered, dressed in uniforms so crisp they seemed untouched by the rain. "Frederick," Marceline whispered, her voice barely audible. "Whose house is this?" He did not answer. The carriage rolled through the gates, and the moment it stopped, a footman opened the door with a precision that made Marceline's pulse stutter. Frederick stepped out first, and as his boots touched the gravel, every servant lining the drive bowed in unison, heads lowered, hands clasped, a silence falling over the courtyard so absolute that even the horses seemed to still. "Your Grace," the head butler said, stepping forward with a deep bow. "Welcome home." Marceline froze in the carriage doorway, her hand still resting on the frame, her mind refusing to process what her ears had just heard. "Your Grace." Frederick turned back to her, offering his hand to help her down, his expression calm in a way that suddenly felt less like composure and more like guilt. "Marceline," he said quietly, "there is something I should have told you." She stepped down from the carriage on legs that did not feel entirely her own, looking past him at the rows of bowing servants, at the towering stone facade of the house behind them, at the crest carved into the iron gates that she now recognized, not as a stranger's mark, but as the seal of one of the oldest and most powerful titles in the land. "You are not a blacksmith," she said, her voice strange to her own ears. "I am a blacksmith," Frederick said. "I have also been, since birth, the Duke of Ravenscar." The courtyard seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She thought of the laughter in Hollow Brook, of the whispers that had called her desperate, foolish, pitiable for marrying a poor smith to save her dying mother. She had not married a poor man. She had married a secret so vast it had its own castle. She did not speak to him for the rest of that evening. A housekeeper named Mrs. Whitfield, kind-eyed and efficient, led Marceline to a suite of rooms grander than anything she had imagined existed, a chamber with a bed large enough to fit 4 people, windows draped in velvet, a private sitting room with its own fireplace, already lit and crackling against the evening chill. "His Grace asked that you have whatever you require," Mrs. Whitfield said, setting out a tray of tea and bread Marceline could not bring herself to touch. "He thought you might wish for quiet after the journey." "Quiet," Marceline repeated faintly. "Yes. Quiet would be welcome." When the housekeeper left, Marceline sat at the edge of the enormous bed, staring at her own reflection in the gilded mirror across the room, a girl in a plain travelling dress, her hair still damp from the earlier rain, looking entirely out of place among silk curtains and polished marble. She thought of every conversation she'd had with Frederick since the storm, the way he spoke too carefully for a man who worked with his hands all day, the way he carried himself, even covered in soot, with a stillness that did not belong to common men. She had noticed these things and dismissed them, because the truth had simply been too large to imagine. A knock came at her door near midnight, soft and hesitant. "Marceline." Frederick's voice, low through the wood. "May I speak with you?" She considered ignoring him. She considered locking the door and pretending sleep, but the questions burning in her chest demanded answers more than her pride demanded silence. "Come in," she said. He entered slowly, dressed now in a fine dark coat that fit him with an elegance the village had never seen, his dark hair still slightly damp. He looked, in that moment, every inch the Duke the servants had called him, and yet there was something uncertain in the way he stood near the door, as though he were not entirely sure of his welcome. "You lied to me," Marceline said, before he could speak. "I withheld a truth," Frederick said. "There is a difference, though I understand why it does not feel like one tonight. Explain it to me, then. Explain the difference between a lie and the truth you let me believe for 3 days." Frederick crossed to the window, his back to her for a long moment, as though gathering words he had carried alone for years and had never needed to speak aloud. "I was raised in this house," he said finally, "heir to a title I never asked for, and a fortune built on the backs of tenant farmers I never met. When my father died, I inherited Ravenscar Court at 23, along with a household of stewards and solicitors who had spent decades skimming coin from estates and tenants, too frightened to complain. So you became a blacksmith," Marceline said, "to hide from your own house." "I became a blacksmith to see what my house truly was," Frederick said, turning back to face her. "I could not trust the reports my stewards gave me. I could not trust the smiling faces of men who managed my estates while quietly stealing from the very people they were meant to protect. So I disappeared into Hollow Brook, took up the forge my father once used as a hunting lodge folly, and lived as a common man long enough to see the truth no duke is ever shown. And what truth was that? That corruption does not announce itself," Frederick said quietly. "It hides in account, books and forged signatures and debts manufactured against innocent families who have no power to fight back. Something cold settled in Marceline's chest. Families like mine." Frederick's jaw tightened. "Your family's debt was not an accident, Marceline. It was engineered, deliberately, by a man who has spent years searching for something your mother possesses, something he believes could destroy him." Marceline rose from the bed, her hands trembling. "What is he searching for? What does my mother have that anyone would want?" "I do not yet know fully," Frederick admitted, "but I know the name of the man behind it. Sebastian Shaw." The name struck her like a blow. "Shaw, as in Edmund Shaw." "His cousin," Frederick said. "And far more dangerous. Sebastian has spent years building influence in Parliament, in the courts, in every circle of power that matters. He needs something your mother holds. Documents, I believe, hidden long ago. And he orchestrated your family's ruin to force her hand." Marceline sat back down, the room spinning slightly around her. "You knew this. Before you proposed to me. You knew my debt was no accident." "I suspected it," Frederick said. "I confirmed it only after our wedding, through inquiries I made while you settled your mother. I should have told you sooner. I am telling you now." "Why marry me at all, then?" Marceline demanded, her voice rising with a mixture of anger and something raw beneath it. "If you knew Sebastian Shaw was hunting my family, why bind yourself to the danger? Unless—" She stopped, a colder thought taking shape. "Unless you needed something from me as well." Frederick's silence answered before his words did. "There is a clause," he said finally, "in my father's will. An old condition, written generations ago, requiring the Duke of Ravenscar to marry before his 29th birthday, or risk losing legal claim over key portions of the estate to the next eligible bloodline." "And who," Marceline asked, though she already feared the answer, "is the next eligible bloodline?" "Sebastian Shaw," Frederick said quietly. "Through a distant and disputed connection, he has spent years trying to legitimize in the courts." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Marceline stared at the man she had married. A duke, a blacksmith, a stranger wearing two faces she was only now beginning to see clearly. "So I am not your wife," she said slowly. "I am your solution, a convenient bride to keep your title safe from your enemy." "That is how it began," Frederick admitted, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that had not been there before. "I will not pretend otherwise to you. I needed a wife before my birthday, and I needed someone Sebastian could not easily corrupt or buy." "But Marceline—" He crossed the room toward her, stopping close enough that she could see the storm still moving behind his dark eyes. "I did not choose you by chance," he said. "I watched you in Hollow Brook for months, before that night in the rain. I watched you defend an old widow from a cruel merchant who tried to cheat her. I watched you give away your own bread to children hungrier than you, when you had little enough for yourself. I watched you care for your mother with a devotion I have rarely seen, even among people who claim to love far more easily than you do." Marcelina's breath caught. "You knew me." "Before the proposal, I knew enough to be certain," Frederick said. "The debt, the deadline, the storm, all of it gave me reason to act when I did. But you, Marceline, were never simply convenient. You were the only choice I ever truly wanted to make." She wanted to believe him. She wanted, desperately, to believe that the hand that had steadied hers in the chapel, the lips that had brushed against hers so gently, had not been performing a role written entirely for his own survival. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to understand what is true and what is merely useful to you." Frederick nodded, though disappointment flickered briefly across his face before he masked it. "Take whatever time you require. I will not press you for more than you are willing to give." He left her alone with the fire and the velvet curtains and the terrible new knowledge that her marriage, meant to save her mother from ruin, had instead placed her directly in the path of a man powerful enough to destroy a duke. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, one Marceline had never imagined for herself. She learned the names of the staff first, Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, whose stern face hid a soft heart, old Thomas the groundskeeper, who tended the gardens with a devotion that bordered on reverence, young Sarah, the maid assigned to her chambers, who blushed and stammered through her first week before slowly warming into easy chatter. She learned, too, that the staff adored Frederick in a way that surprised her, not the distant respect owed to a title, but something closer to affection, the kind earned through years of quiet kindness rather than commanded by rank. "He raised my wages himself," Sarah confided one morning, helping Marceline dress for the day, before any steward could argue him out of it. "Said no one should work a full season and still go hungry come winter." "He sounds very different from how the village described him," Marceline said carefully. "The village never knew him, milady," Sarah said. "Begging your pardon." "They knew a smith who kept to himself. They never knew the man who runs this whole estate without a single tenant going hungry, not since he took the title. Mind you," Sarah lowered her voice with a small, conspiratorial smile, "he is still terribly stubborn about asking for help with anything at all. Mrs. Whitfield says he would rather shoe a horse himself in the rain than admit his backaches afterward." Marceline could not help a small laugh at that, the first true laugh she had managed since arriving at Ravenscar Court. "That, at least, sounds exactly like the man I married." She watched Frederick at a distance during the day, reviewing ledgers in his study with a focus that bordered on obsession, meeting tenants personally to hear grievances most lords would have left to a steward, riding the estate boundaries himself to inspect fences and drainage, and a dozen small details that should have been beneath a duke's notice. He was, she began to realize, nothing like the cold, calculating men of the aristocracy she had glimpsed from a distance her whole life. He worked harder than any servant in his employ, asked for less comfort than he provided to others, and carried himself, even within his own grand house, with the same quiet humility she remembered from the rain-soaked forge. And yet there remained a wall between them, a careful, deliberate distance Frederick maintained even as warmth crept steadily into every other corner of their shared life. It was during the long evenings in the library that the wall first began to crack. Marceline had taken to spending her evenings there, drawn by the towering shelves of books she had never had the luxury to read, and Frederick, though she suspected he could have avoided her easily in a house this size, began joining her with increasing frequency, ostensibly to review estate documents by the same fire. "You read faster than anyone I have ever met," he observed one evening, watching her turn the final page of a novel she had started only 2 days prior. "I have spent years with very little to occupy a quiet evening," Marceline said. "Books were the one luxury poverty could not entirely take from me, so long as the lending library remained open." "What did you read in Hollow Brook?" "Whatever I could borrow," she admitted. "Mostly old poetry. Sometimes histories, though I confess I preferred the poetry. There was more truth in it, somehow, than in all the dry facts of kings and wars." A rare smile tugged at the corner of Frederick's mouth. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman, scolding you for Byron and failing entirely to stop you reading him anyway." Marceline blinked, startled into a laugh. "How did you know it was Byron? Because you have the particular look of a woman defending a scandalous poet," Frederick said, the dryness in his voice so understated she nearly missed the joke entirely. "I have seen that look before, usually right before someone is asked to leave a drawing room." "You are teasing me, Your Grace." "I am," he said gravely, as though confessing to a crime. "I find I am rather poor at stopping, once I have begun." It was such an unexpected, quiet bit of humour from a man she had only ever known as solemn that Marceline found herself laughing properly, the sound surprising them both. Frederick's expression softened at the sound of it, something almost wondering in the way he watched her. "I should write to my mother again soon," she said, once her laughter settled. "She will worry if I am silent too long. I have already arranged for a physician closer to Ravenscar to call on her weekly," Frederick said, "and I have instructed my steward to see her moved into a proper cottage on the estate grounds, should you wish it, once she is well enough to travel." Marceline looked up at him, surprised. "You did this without telling me?" "I did not wish to raise your hopes before the arrangements were certain," Frederick said. "Forgive me if that was the wrong instinct." "No," Marceline said, something unfamiliar and warm spreading through her chest. "No, it was not the wrong instinct at all." Their eyes held for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, and Marceline became suddenly acutely aware of how close he sat, of the particular way the firelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the careful stillness in his hands, as though he too were fighting some instinct he had not yet given himself permission to follow. "Frederick," she said quietly, "may I ask you something honestly?" "Always." "Do you regret it? Marrying me the way you did, out of necessity, out of a clause neither of us chose?" He considered the question with the same gravity he gave to every decision she had watched him make. "I have never regretted marrying you," he said finally. "I have only regretted the manner in which I did it, the secrets I let stand between us when honesty would have served us both better." "That is a very different thing, Marceline, from regretting you." She did not trust herself to respond. Instead, she let the silence stretch comfortably between them, the kind of silence that no longer felt like distance, but like something slowly, carefully becoming its opposite. It was the following week, during a sudden afternoon storm that caught them returning from the village church, that the careful distance between them finally began to dissolve in earnest. The carriage jolted hard over a rutted lane, throwing Marceline sideways, and Frederick's hand shot out instinctively to steady her, his fingers closing around hers before either of them could think better of it. Neither moved away. The rain hammered against the carriage roof, and inside the air felt suddenly close, charged with something neither of them dared name. Frederick's thumb moved once, slowly, against the back of her hand. An absent gesture, perhaps, or perhaps not absent at all. "Your hands are cold," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. "They are often cold," Marceline said, though she made no move to pull away. He turned her hand over slowly in his, studying the calluses she had earned from years of washing, scrubbing, mending, the marks of a life spent surviving rather than being cared for. He traced one faint scar near her thumb with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "How did you come by this?" "A kitchen knife," she admitted. "I was 12 and far too proud to ask my mother for help cutting bread." "Stubborn even then," he murmured, and there was something fond in his voice that undid her more thoroughly than any declaration could have. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the journey, but his hand did not leave hers, and by the time the carriage reached the edge of the estate, Marceline had stopped pretending, even to herself, that the warmth spreading through her chest was anything but want. The carriage drew to a halt before Ravenscar Court, just as the rain thickened into a true downpour, and Frederick stepped down first, turning to help her descend into the storm. The wind had picked up considerably, tugging at her cloak, and before she could protest, Frederick shrugged off his own coat and settled it over her shoulders without a word. It was a small gesture, simple and practical, the sort of thing any gentleman might do for any lady caught in foul weather. And yet his fingers lingered at her collar a moment longer than the task required, adjusting the heavy fabric, brushing rain-damp hair gently away from her neck, with a care that made the practical gesture feel like something else entirely. "You will catch a chill," he said, his voice low, his eyes not quite meeting hers, as though he were as startled by his own tenderness as she was. "You forget," Marceline said softly. "I have weathered far worse storms than this one." "Not on my account, you haven't," Frederick murmured, and something in the words, the quiet weight he placed on my account, as though her comfort had become, somewhere in these past weeks, a thing he measured himself against, made her chest ache with a feeling she did not yet have a name for. She looked up at him through the rain, his coat heavy and warm around her shoulders, smelling faintly of cedar and the forge he could not quite leave behind, even in silk and fine wool. And for one long moment neither of them moved, the storm forgotten entirely. "Frederick," she whispered. "Yes." She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. The way his eyes searched her face, the way his breath caught when she leaned, almost imperceptibly, closer to him. It said everything words could not yet manage to say, but the footman opened the great doors before either of them could close the distance entirely, and the moment dissolved into the practical business of stepping into warmth and dry stone, leaving only the ache of what had almost happened to linger between them, long into the night. The peace of Ravenscar Court did not last. It was Mrs. Whitfield who brought the first warning, her face pale as she entered Frederick's study one morning while Marceline sat nearby, reviewing household accounts, at his quiet insistence that she learn the running of the estate. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, "a letter has arrived. Marked urgent. From your solicitor in London." Frederick read the letter in silence, his expression darkening with each line, and when he finished, he set it down on the desk with a stillness that frightened Marceline more than any outburst could have. "What is it?" she asked. Sebastian Shaw has filed a formal challenge in court, Frederick said, disputing the legitimacy of my succession, claiming irregularities in the original inheritance documents drafted by my grandfather. Can he succeed? Not easily, Frederick said, but he does not need to succeed outright. He need only delay the matter long enough to sow doubt, to weaken my standing among the other peers whose support I require to maintain influence. Doubt is a slow poison, Marceline. It does not need to kill quickly to be effective. Marceline rose from her chair, crossing to stand beside him. What does he truly want? You said before that he sought something my mother possessed. I believe, Frederick said slowly, that your mother holds documents proving fraud committed decades ago. Land seized illegally, titles forged, votes in Parliament bought through bribery that Sebastian's own father orchestrated. If such evidence surfaced, it would not merely embarrass Sebastian. It would destroy every claim to legitimacy his family has built for 2 generations. And he believes my mother has kept this evidence hidden all these years? I believe your father did, Frederick said carefully. Before his death, I believe he entrusted it to your mother, perhaps without fully explaining what it was, to protect her from the danger of knowing too much. Marceline's mind raced back through fragments of memory, her father's locked writing desk, the small tin box her mother kept beneath her bed and never once opened in Marceline's presence, the strange visitors who had called on her father in the years before his death, always departing quickly, always speaking in tones too low to overhear. I must write to her, Marceline said. I must ask her directly. Carefully, Frederick warned. If Sebastian's men intercept such a letter, we hand him exactly the confirmation he seeks. They composed the letter together that evening, careful and oblique, asking only that Phoebe consider whether she still possessed any of her late husband's old papers, framed as a matter of settling old family business rather than the desperate hunt it truly was. The reply came nearly 2 weeks later, delivered by a private courier Frederick trusted absolutely, and it confirmed everything they had feared and hoped in equal measure. My dearest Marceline, your father left me a small tin box many years ago with instructions never to open it unless our family's survival depended upon it. I confess I have never looked inside, trusting his judgment as I always did. If you believe the time has come, I will send it to you, though I beg you to guard it with your life. Your father did not give such warnings lightly. Your loving mother, Phoebe. Frederick read the letter twice before setting it down, his expression grim. She must not send it by courier alone. Sebastian has eyes everywhere, even among trusted men. I will travel to Hollowbrook myself and retrieve it personally. Then I am coming with you, Marceline said. Marceline, it is not safe. It is my mother, she said, her voice firm in a way that left no room for argument. And my father's box. I will not sit in this castle waiting for news while the people I love face danger on my behalf. Frederick studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind the worry in his eyes. I had a feeling you would say exactly that, and yet you tried regardless. A husband is permitted to try, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting despite the gravity of the morning. He is simply not permitted to expect success where you are concerned. Then we understand each other perfectly, Marceline said. We leave at first light. The journey to Hollowbrook was tense, both of them watching the road behind them more often than the road ahead. But they arrived without incident, and Phoebe Roberts, looking healthier than Marceline had seen her in years, thanks to proper food and rest and Frederick's physician, greeted them with tears and the small, unremarkable tin box that had haunted their thoughts for 2 weeks. It was on the return journey, as evening fell and a fresh storm threatened the western sky, that disaster nearly struck. The carriage rounded a narrow bend in the road, and Frederick's coachman shouted a warning a heartbeat before two horses burst from the tree line, blocking the path entirely, their riders' faces obscured by dark scarves. "Down!" Frederick said sharply, pulling Marceline low against the carriage seat as the first shot cracked through the evening air, splintering wood near the driver's box. "Frederick, stay down," he ordered, and there was a fierceness in his voice she had never heard before. Not the careful, measured duke she had come to know, but something raw, something willing to bleed for her without a second's hesitation. The coachman, a former soldier Frederick had hired specifically for his estate's growing dangers, returned fire with a steady hand, and the horses bolted forward at his sharp command, the carriage lurching wildly down the lane as the attackers' shouts faded behind them. When they finally slowed, miles further down the road, Marceline found herself shaking uncontrollably, the tin box clutched tight against her chest, Frederick's arms wrapped around her without either of them quite deciding to close that distance. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair, his own voice unsteady. "You are safe, Marceline. I have you." "They meant to kill us," she whispered, "or to take the box." "Both, likely," Frederick said grimly. "Sebastian grows desperate. Desperate men make dangerous mistakes, but they also become far more willing to risk everything." She lifted her face to look at him, and the fear in his eyes was not for himself. It had never once, in the chaos of the ambush, been for himself. "Frederick," she breathed, "I was so frightened. Not for myself. For you." Something broke open in his expression at her words, some final wall he had been holding carefully in place since the night of their wedding. "Marceline," he said roughly, his hand cradling her face, with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence they had just survived. "I have faced enemies, lawsuits, and ruin without losing a single night's sleep. But the thought of losing you tonight—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He closed the distance between them at last, his lips finding hers with a hunger he had clearly been restraining for weeks, gentle at first and then deepening as she answered him with equal need, her fingers curling into the lapel of his coat, as though anchoring herself against everything the night had nearly stolen from them. When they finally parted, both breathless, the rain had begun to fall again outside the carriage windows, but neither of them noticed the cold any longer. "I should have done that weeks ago," Frederick murmured against her temple. "Yes," Marceline agreed softly, "you should have." But the storm that night had no intention of releasing them so easily. The coachman, wary of further ambush along the open road in failing light, guided the carriage instead toward Silver Oak Hall, a modest hunting lodge belonging to a distant Ravenscar cousin, its windows dark, but its doors, fortunately, unlocked to any traveller bearing the family crest. "We will wait out the worst of it here," Frederick said, helping Marceline down into the howling wind and continue home once the road is safe again. Inside, the lodge was cold and sparsely furnished, but a fire was soon coaxed to life in the modest hearth, and Marceline found herself wrapped in a worn blanket, pulled from an old trunk, sitting close beside Frederick as thunder rattled the shuttered windows. "This is not quite the home I promised you," Frederick said, glancing around the dusty room with something like rueful amusement. "I have slept in worse," Marceline said, "though I admit a duke's hunting lodge is a considerable improvement on most of them." He laughed softly at that, a real laugh, low and unguarded, the kind she had only begun to draw from him in these past weeks. The firelight caught the line of his jaw, the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes, and Marceline felt, watching him, a tenderness so fierce it startled her. "You frightened me terribly today," she admitted quietly. "I do not think I have ever been so afraid in my life. Not even the night Edmund Shaw came to my door." "I am sorry for that," Frederick said, his humour fading into something more solemn. "I never wished to bring danger into your life, Marceline. I have spent these past weeks wondering whether I was selfish to ask you to share it." "You were not selfish," she said. "You were honest, eventually. That is more than most men manage." He reached for her hand again, lacing his fingers through hers with a slowness that felt almost ceremonial. "There is something I have wanted to tell you," he said, his voice low, "since the night of the ambush. Perhaps since, long before that, if I am honest with myself." Marceline's heart climbed into her throat. "Tell me." Frederick began and then stopped, his gaze dropping briefly to their joined hands before lifting again to meet hers, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had never seen there before. "Marceline, when I think of this house, of the title, of everything Sebastian threatens to take, none of it frightens me the way the thought of losing you does. I did not expect to feel this. I am not certain I know entirely what to do with it." "Frederick," she started, leaning toward him, the firelight warm against her skin, the words rising in her own chest, desperate to be spoken at last. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the lodge, followed immediately by the lodge-keeper's frantic knocking and a shouted warning that a tree had come down across the only road, and the moment dissolved into urgent practicalities. Lanterns lit, the coachman summoned, contingencies discussed, leaving the words unspoken between them, suspended in the space the storm had interrupted. They did not finish that conversation that night, but Marceline carried the unfinished sentence with her long after the storm passed, certain now of what waited at the end of it, and equally certain that whatever waited would not stay silent for very much longer. The documents inside the tin box, once finally examined by Frederick's trusted solicitor, proved more damning than either of them had dared hope. Letters in the late Lord Shaw's own hand detailed bribes paid to judges, forged deeds transferring stolen tenant land into the Shaw family's holdings, and a ledger tracking decades of fraud that implicated not only Sebastian's father, but Sebastian himself in continuing the scheme since inheriting his title. "This is enough to end him," Frederick said, reviewing the final pages by candlelight, "properly presented, before the right witnesses. This destroys every claim to legitimacy the Shaw name has built." "Then why not present it immediately?" Marceline asked. "Because Sebastian Shaw is cunning enough to discredit evidence presented quietly," Frederick said. "I intend to ruin him publicly, before every peer whose support matters, in a setting he cannot control or escape. The Ravenscar Winter Ball, held annually and attended by nearly every notable family in the region, provided exactly such a setting, and Sebastian, confident in his own social standing and unaware of what evidence Frederick now possessed, accepted his invitation without hesitation. Marceline's gown for the evening, a deep emerald silk that Frederick had commissioned weeks earlier without telling her the occasion, fit her like it had been poured rather than sewn, the candlelight catching the fabric in a way that made even Mrs. Whitfield pause in admiration when she descended the staircase that evening. "You look every inch the Duchess you have become," Frederick said, waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs in formal black, his dark eyes taking her in with an appreciation that made her cheeks warm. "I still feel, some days, like a blacksmith's accidental bride," Marceline admitted. "Then allow me to remind you otherwise," Frederick said, offering his arm, "every single time you doubt it. Though I confess, I rather miss the smith's apron. It hid considerably less than this waistcoat does, and yet somehow I feel far more exposed tonight." Marceline laughed, despite the nerves tightening her chest. "That, Your Grace, may be the most honest thing you have ever said to a room full of nobility." "Fortunately," he murmured, leading her toward the ballroom doors, "I have not yet said it to the room." only to you. The ballroom, when they entered, glittered with candlelight and the low murmur of aristocratic gossip, and Marceline felt the familiar weight of judging eyes settle upon her. The village girl, the convenient bride. The woman half the room still whispered had married above her station through nothing but desperate luck. A pair of elderly matrons near the punch table eyed her openly, one leaning to whisper something behind a fan, clearly expecting Marceline to wilt under the scrutiny the way a properly intimidated commoner should. Lady Hartwell, Marceline said instead, approaching them with a serene smile, having learned both women's names from Mrs. Whitfield that very afternoon precisely for this purpose. I understand your husband's hounds took first prize again this season. How fortunate that something in your household continues to perform exactly as bred and trained to. Lady Hartwell's fan stilled mid-flutter, her companion smothering a startled laugh behind her glove, and the two matrons retreated toward the refreshments with considerably less appetite for gossip than they had arrived with. Sebastian Shaw found Frederick and Marceline within the hour, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, bowing just enough to satisfy propriety. "And the new Duchess. How delightfully rustic this marriage has proven for the gossip columns." "Mr. Shaw," Frederick said, his tone pleasant, but carrying an edge Marceline had learned to recognize as warning. "I trust you are enjoying the evening." "Immensely," Sebastian said, his gaze sliding to Marceline with an appraising cruelty he did not bother to hide. "Tell me, Duchess, does it not trouble you, knowing your husband only married you to satisfy an inheritance clause? I imagine it must sting, being chosen for convenience rather than affection." The nearby guests, sensing scandal, had begun to quiet, leaning subtly closer to catch every word. Marceline felt the old fear rise in her chest, the same fear that had haunted her through every whispered insult in Hollow Brook. But this time, something steadier rose alongside it. She thought of the months she had spent proving herself capable of managing an entire estate's accounts. She thought of the tenants who had begun greeting her by name with genuine warmth. She thought of Frederick's hand closing around hers in the storm, and the truth in his voice when he told her she had never been merely convenient. "Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent circle of guests, "I find it curious that a man so concerned with the legitimacy of others' marriages has spent considerable effort these past months attempting to manufacture debts against innocent families, simply to recover documents that prove his own father's fraud." Sebastian's smile faltered for the first time. "I do not know what you mean." "I believe you know precisely what I mean," Marceline continued, stepping forward without flinching. "Documents detailing bribes to judges, forged land deeds, a ledger spanning 2 decades of theft from tenants who trusted your family's name. Documents my own father died protecting, and which now rest quite safely in possession of His Grace's solicitor." A murmur swept through the gathered crowd, sharp with shock and rising scandal. "Lies," Sebastian said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Desperate fabrications from a woman clawing for relevance in a world she does not belong to." "Then you will have no objection," Frederick said calmly, stepping beside Marceline, with quiet pride evident in every line of his posture, "to my solicitor presenting these documents before the appropriate magistrates next week. If they are fabrications, as you say, you have nothing to fear." Sebastian's face had drained of colour entirely now, the gathered peers around them watching with the particular hunger of an aristocracy that fed eagerly on the downfall of its own kind. "You will regret this," Sebastian hissed, low enough that only Frederick and Marceline could hear. "I regret only the years your family stole from people who trusted you," Frederick said, his voice cold as the winter air beyond the ballroom windows. "Good evening, Mr. Shaw." Sebastian turned and fled the ballroom shortly after, his social standing already crumbling in the wake of whispers that would, by morning, have spread across every drawing room in the county. The orchestra resumed playing moments later, and Frederick turned to Marceline, offering his hand with a warmth that had nothing to do with the scandal they had just survived. "Dance with me," he said. She placed her hand in his without hesitation, and as he drew her into the slow turn of the waltz, the rest of the room seemed to fall away entirely, the candlelight blurring into soft gold, the music fading into something distant and unimportant, until there was nothing left in the world but the steady warmth of his hand at her waist, and the way he looked at her, as though she were the only truth he had ever fully trusted. "I am no longer afraid of loving you," Marceline whispered, somewhere in the middle of that dance. Frederick's arms tightened slightly around her. "Then you have given me a gift far greater than any title I was ever born to." The formal hearing took place 3 weeks later, in a chamber crowded with magistrates, peers, and the quiet, satisfied presence of Frederick's solicitor, who laid out 2 decades of fraud with a precision that left no room for Sebastian's increasingly desperate denials. Marceline sat beside Frederick throughout, her hand steady in his, watching as the careful conspiracy Sebastian Shaw had built across years finally collapsed beneath the weight of evidence her own father had died protecting. By the hearing's end, Sebastian's claim to the Ravenscar succession had been dismissed entirely, his standing among the peerage shattered beyond repair, his family's stolen lands ordered returned to the tenants from whom they had been seized. He left the chamber a broken man, stripped of the influence he had spent a lifetime building on a foundation of lies. Frederick's inheritance, and the duchy itself, stood secure at last. That evening, as the last carriages of solicitors and witnesses rolled away from Ravenscar Court, Frederick found Marceline standing alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the autumn air cool against her skin, the stars emerging slowly through clearing clouds. "It is finally over," she said softly, as he came to stand beside her. "It is," Frederick agreed, "and I find myself owing a great debt to the woman responsible for saving it." Marceline turned to face him, surprised. "You saved your duchy, Frederick, through your own courage, your own investigation." "I married you to satisfy a clause," Frederick said quietly, taking her hands in his. "I believed, in the beginning, that the marriage alone would be enough to secure what I needed." "I was wrong, Marceline. It was never the marriage that saved Ravenscar Court. It was you." He drew a slow breath, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles. "I married you because I needed a duchess," he said. "Somewhere along the way, I discovered I needed you." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Marceline's eyes. "Frederick, let me finish," he said softly. "I have wanted to say that to you properly since the night the storm interrupted us at Silver Oak Hall. I have carried it since, waiting for the right moment, and I find there is no moment more right than this one, with the danger finally behind us, and nothing left standing between what I feel and what I am finally permitted to say. I love you. Not because the law required it of me, not because the title demanded it. I love you because you are the bravest, most generous soul I have ever known, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of having found you." Marceline rose onto her toes, framing his face with both hands, and kissed him with all the certainty she had been too afraid to claim until that very moment. "I love you too," she said, against his lips. "I think I have, since the night you stood in that storm and looked at me as though I were already worth choosing, long before either of us understood what choosing would cost." Behind them, unnoticed, a handful of staff had gathered at the terrace doors, watching with the particular satisfaction of servants who had spent months quietly wagering on exactly this moment. "Told. You he'd admit it before winter's end," Sarah whispered to Mrs. Whitfield, pressing a coin into the older woman's palm with theatrical reluctance. I had hoped for fewer storms involved in the getting there mind. My wager did not account for ambushes. "Hush, girl," Mrs. Whitfield murmured, though her own eyes were suspiciously bright as she ushered the gathered staff back inside, leaving the new Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar Court alone beneath the clearing stars. In the months that followed, Phoebe Roberts moved permanently into a comfortable cottage on the Ravenscar estate, her health steadily improving under proper care, her laughter filling the gardens whenever she visited her daughter for tea. The village of Hollow Brook, once so quick to laugh at Marceline's desperate marriage, spoke of her now with a very different tone. The girl who had married a poor smith and become a duchess, who had faced down one of the most powerful men in the county, and one who had proven, in the end, that courage mattered far more than the circumstances one was born into. And at Ravenscar Court, beneath towers that no longer felt cold or foreign, but simply like home, Marceline and Frederick built a marriage neither inheritance clauses nor manufactured debts had ever truly created. One built instead on trust earned slowly, respect given freely, and a love that had grown, against every expectation, into something neither of them had dared hope to find. She had not married a poor blacksmith to save her mother. She had married a duke, desperate to save his duchy. But in the end, it was Marceline Roberts who had saved them both. And so, dear viewers, the storm that once threatened to destroy everything Marceline Roberts loved became instead the very storm that led her to the truest love she would ever know. We hope this tale of courage, secrets, and slow-burning devotion has stayed with you the way it stayed with us in the telling. If these old Victorian romances bring you comfort, joy, or a little thrill of hope, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share where in the world you are watching from. Your support means more to us than you know, and it is the reason we are able to keep bringing these stories to life. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. Until our next tale together, take care, and may your own story be touched with just as much courage and just as much love.